Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Jordan, and I am an Employer Services Manager here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I am co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Toolkit webinar. Julie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Kelly. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I provide education for employers that is focused on creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. This includes discussing the guidelines under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It includes identifying ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations and sharing best practices and guidance for making the workplace accessible.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a helpful learner's guide, which can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope this information is helpful for you. Also, OOD does not endorse products, services, or vendors. However, we will share examples throughout the webinar to illustrate possible solutions and resources for reasonable accommodations. We will be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and again before we conclude to answer questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so they're ready for us when we stop. Julie, would you like to address the accessibility practices we have included in today's webinar?
Sure, we plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide and PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text to visual images. Also, in our delivery, Kelly and I mention each other by name as the conversation between us goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
Julie, today's webinar is a complement to the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook that is archived in our webinar library on the OOD website. In that webinar series, the first 5 sessions focused on best practices for navigating the interactive process through the lens of a specific disability type. The disability groups we presented on included intellectual, physical, mental health, and sensory disabilities, and we included a session on neurodiversity in the workplace. Each session provided a general overview of the disability type, addressed specific ways to make the workplace more inclusive, and shared ideas and examples for providing effective reasonable accommodations. We concluded the series with a session addressing what employers can ask and why, and focused on how knowing this information can help employers foster a disability-inclusive workplace culture. I'm interested to know what your inspiration was for today's topic.
Well, Kelly, as you know, one of my roles at the agency is to provide consultations for our employer partners when they have questions or goals related to worksite accessibility, disability inclusion, and providing reasonable accommodations. A few years ago, we had an employer partner who requested a consult to support their goal of creating a resource guide for the employees who facilitated their reasonable accommodation process. They wanted one place where they could access the resources that would help them identify ideas for reasonable accommodations and would best support an efficient and effective process. As we were concluding the employer's reasonable accommodation handbook, I remembered this employer and realized the resource guide that was created was a tool that could benefit all employers. So that inspired this webinar, which will include the resources or tools we shared during the consult plus additional ideas so all employers can create their own reasonable accommodation toolkit to support their process.
Julie, I like this idea, and it's a great complement to the Employers Reasonable Accommodation Handbook webinar series archived on our website. Developing a reasonable accommodation toolkit is a great example of an action step employers can take to be proactive in their efforts to create disability-inclusive workplace cultures. What is included in this toolkit?
Kelly, first we will address how to create an effective reasonable accommodation statement and where to post this, so candidates and employees with disabilities know how to request an accommodation if they need one. Then we will share resources employers can use to generate ideas for effective reasonable accommodation solutions. We will discuss the external resources that are available to employers when they need assistance in identifying a solution. And we will conclude with discussing ways to implement and monitor accommodations effectively. We know providing a reasonable accommodation is always a collaborative process between the individual making the request and the employer, and the effective solution is determined on a case-by-case basis because each person, job, employer, and workplace is unique. The solution for one situation may not be the right answer for the next situation. However, having a toolkit with a collection of resources can serve as a great starting point for identifying possibilities and certainly should be combined with a customized assessment of the specific situation to determine the best solution.
Julie, it sounds like we're going to share a lot of good tips to help our employer partners develop their own toolkit, and I'm excited to learn more. We have had employers ask us about how to create an effective reasonable accommodation statement, and that seems like a good place to start.
I agree, Kelly. The reasonable accommodation statement invites an individual with a disability to contact the employer when they encounter a barrier in the hiring process or the workplace and would like to request an accommodation. Now, certainly communicating this statement helps an employer to fulfill their obligations under Title I of the ADA, but it also helps an employer communicate to candidates and employees that they are a disability inclusive employer. So knowing how to craft this statement and where to post it is a very helpful tool. Under the ADA, employers are not required to use a specific or formal reasonable accommodation statement, which means employers have the freedom to craft this statement and communicate their commitment to providing accommodations in a way that is unique to them.
Julie, I'm sure employers appreciate having the flexibility to communicate this disability inclusive message in a way that is unique to their workplace. What is included in a reasonable accommodation statement?
Kelly, it's pretty simple. This should include a general statement about reasonable accommodation that informs individuals with disabilities of the right to request an accommodation. The statement should include contact information for the person or group responsible for receiving and facilitating the request. And the statement should indicate multiple ways to make a request, such as through a phone call, an email, or another form of communication. This is important for employers to know because individuals with disabilities are permitted to request accommodations in their preferred form of communication. Some employers combine this statement with their Equal Employment Opportunity or EEO statement, which is a statement that communicates to everyone that the employer has no intention of discriminating based on disability or any other prohibited basis. So, for example, your reasonable accommodation statement could reference that you are an equal opportunity employer and that all qualified applicants will receive consideration for employment without regard to race, color, religion, sex, disability, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, veteran status, or genetic information. Then you can add a statement that reinforces your commitment to providing access, equal opportunity, and reasonable accommodation for individuals with disabilities in employment, services, programs, and activities. This statement should also include contact information, like a name, telephone number, and an email address to make the request. At other times, the reasonable accommodation statement will stand alone, like when it's included in an invitation to applicants for an interview. Again, provide contact information so the candidate can arrange for an accommodation if one is needed to participate in the interview. We have provided a reasonable accommodation statement example in the learner's guide that accompanies this training. To support the effectiveness of this statement, it's a best practice to describe the work-related activity or environment in a way that helps the individual to know whether they need an accommodation. For example, in an invitation for an interview, it's helpful to inform the candidate whether the interview is virtual or in person, and whether a pre-employment test is computer-based or requires handling materials, like maneuvering product from one place to another.
Informing employers to include a description of the workplace or work activity with the reasonable accommodation statement is a very helpful tip for employers, Julie, because it benefits both parties. It better informs individuals with disabilities of whether they need an accommodation, and if they do, it may encourage them to ask for one sooner rather than later, which can help the employer to provide the accommodation effectively and without delay. Now let's talk about where the reasonable accommodation statement should be included.
Kelly, it's a best practice to include a reasonable accommodation statement in those key areas where applicants and employees seek information, like in job postings, applications, job descriptions, employee handbooks, and in reasonable accommodation policies. It's also important to include this statement in invitations to activities and events, like interviews, presentations, meetings, and conferences. And like we said, remember to describe the activity or event so an individual knows whether they need a reasonable accommodation. As you pointed out, this helps both the person and the employer be prepared to request and implement accommodations without delay. For example, let's say an employer invites candidates to interview for an open position, and in the invitation, they state all candidates will be required to take a pre-employment test. They include their general reasonable accommodation statement. However, they do not describe the test. On the day of the interview, a candidate arrives to participate, and when it comes time to take the test, they discover it is a computer-based exam that includes using a keyboard and mouse. The individual has a limitation with fine motor control due to a disability and is suddenly concerned about being able to complete the test. If the invitation would have described the test as computer-based using a keyboard and mouse, the candidate would have had the opportunity to consider requesting a reasonable accommodation to take the test another way, maybe through using speech dictation software or a scribe to record their answers. Without that upfront information, the candidate now has to decide whether to ask for a reasonable accommodation, which could delay the hiring process for the candidate and the employer.
Julie, that's a great point about how describing the work-related activity helps the individual to know if they need an accommodation and also helps to prevent delays in important events like interviews and testing. It reminds me of a situation one of our employer partners experienced when hiring a new employee. During the interview, the employer described not only the duties and tasks of the position, but they also shared the work environment, equipment, and software the employee would be required to use to complete their work assignments. The individual interviewing for the position had low vision, which wouldn't necessarily be apparent to the employer, and would need a large screen monitor to be able to see their work. Because the employer shared these additional details with all of the individuals they were interviewing, this individual knew an accommodation would be needed. The employer extended an offer to the individual and included a reasonable accommodation statement in the offer letter. Because of this, the employee knew who to contact to request the large screen monitor and did so right away. This afforded the employer the opportunity to secure the accommodation, which was the large screen monitor, and have it in place on the individual's first day of employment so they could start their training at the same time as the rest of their hiring class. Now, that's just one example of how providing a reasonable accommodation statement early in the process gave the employer and the employee a chance to have the accommodations in place so the employee could hit the ground running on day one. Julie, I know you talked about other key areas to post these statements as well. Now, I'd like to give the employers attending today a chance to weigh in. Based on the reasonable accommodation statement ideas we've highlighted today, have you identified an area where you already include or would like to add your reasonable accommodation statement? If you would like to share that with us, please type this in the Q&A box, and we'll read some of these during the first Q&A break. Okay, so now employers have created their reasonable accommodation statement and posted these in key areas, and the requests are coming in. The next step is to begin the interactive process and collaborate with the individual to identify an effective solution.
That's right, Kelly. One of the challenges the employer partner I consulted with reported was sometimes an employee who experienced a barrier at work didn't get directed to the human resources or HR department to begin the conversation and explore ideas. What was happening was an employee would ask their supervisor for a change at work, and if the supervisor was not familiar with a solution, they assumed there was not one, and the process stopped there, instead of the supervisor referring the employee to HR. It wasn't clear whether these conversations included a disclosure about a disability. Now, we know it's common for employees to disclose a disability to their supervisor rather than someone in HR, and sometimes this includes a request for a reasonable accommodation. But a request can be subtle. So this employer planned to inform their supervisors of how to recognize a request and instruct them to refer individuals to HR when they received one, so HR can begin the interactive process. The employer also wanted HR to have a collection of resources to reference during the interactive process to help generate ideas specific to their workplace and jobs. Now, often individuals with disabilities know what they need as an effective, reasonable accommodation, so that's always the best place to start.
Julie, what tools can we share to help employers generate ideas for solutions when they are collaborating with the candidates and employees during the interactive process?
Kelly, I have a few ideas. The first tool I suggested was to review the types of accommodations they have previously provided. Now, we know that each request needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis, but having an idea of what was provided before can be a helpful starting point. If employers are not tracking previous accommodations, this may be a good step to add to their process. This can help inform ideas for future requests, but tracking accommodations can also help uncover barriers in the environment, inspire changes to improve accessibility, and inform centralized accommodation and accessibility funds for future items and improvements. The Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, also has resources employers may find helpful in identifying effective, reasonable accommodations. The first is JAN's Searchable Online Accommodation Resource, known as SOAR. This resource allows the user to search by a specific topic and then provides a variety of resources to review. For example, if the user searches diabetes, SOAR will provide general information about this condition, suggest apps for managing diabetes, discuss how service dogs may be used as a reasonable accommodation, and provide guidance about this condition from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. The other resource is JAN's A to Z list, which is organized by disability type, limitation, work-related function, topic, and accommodation. These options enable the user to quickly find the resources they need. For example, under the heading of accommodation, if the user selects technology, this resource brings up information about assistive technology, including steps on how to select, implement, and monitor effective technology solutions. It also includes real-life examples. One of these examples is about a teacher who has difficulty communicating with students because his speech becomes soft and slurred when he is fatigued. This limitation is related to his condition of multiple sclerosis. During the interactive process, he and his employer identified that a personal speech amplifier may be effective, so this was provided. This assistive technology enabled the teacher to project his voice without any strain. He was also permitted to schedule his classes so he could take periodic breaks.
Julie, thank you for sharing that example. How was the consult helpful in further identifying resources the employer could use to search for accommodation ideas?
Kelly, as a part of the consult, the employer requested I observe 2 work areas. One was a distribution center and one was an office environment. During my on-site visit, I observed the common areas, workstations, equipment and tools, and environmental factors like temperature, lighting, and noise. I also informally observed employees performing work to consider working postures, behaviors, and task frequency. Based on this information, I was able to research resources the employer could add to their toolkit to access when they needed to explore ideas for reasonable accommodations for these work environments. Now, these weren't intended to be all-inclusive, but they provided the employer a place to start to begin their search, possibly saving them time in having to find these types of resources on their own. One tool I provided to the employer was an online catalog of products and equipment related to ergonomics. Some of the items for the office setting included chairs, glare filters for computer monitors, keyboard and mouse options, footrests, arm supports, and monitor mounts. The reason sharing a resource like this is helpful is because sometimes it's not easy to imagine the possibility of overcoming a barrier in the workplace until you become aware of potential solutions. For example, if an employee requested a reasonable accommodation to support their upper body posture and arms while inputting data into the computer, an employer may not know how to provide this if they haven't observed a similar solution. The online catalog offered a variety of arm supports the employee and the employer could review together to determine if one of these may be an effective solution. We have one example pictured in the PowerPoint of 2 arm supports affixed to the front part of a workstation, one on the right and one on the left. A keyboard is also present in the front middle of the workstation, and a mouse is on a mouse pad to the right side of the keyboard.
That's a good example, Julie. Okay, I think it's a good time to take questions and maybe share some examples from our audience members about where they plan to post their reasonable accommodation statements based on the key areas we shared as best practices. Just so everyone is aware, we did receive some pre-submitted questions with the registration. All right, Julie, one employer shared with us that they like to make sure reasonable accommodation statements are included in meeting invites, especially when they involve people that the person does not know. And that's a great tip.
It is a great tip. And what I'd add to that is meetings are happening in the virtual space, in the physical environment. And so describing that environment in the invitation can help support that statement. So thank you for sharing that. That's one place you're including those.
Julie, one of the questions we had submitted to us ahead of time is where should we post the reasonable accommodation statement on our hiring site?
Thanks, Kelly. I wanted to share with everybody that there's a resource from the Job Accommodation Network, which is JAN, that said the best practice here really is to make sure your reasonable accommodation statement is located on the primary page of your hiring site, the first page of that system, and then within 2 clicks of any page off of that. So never 2 clicks away from that main page, it should also be included. So in other words, as they put it, really, you want to put it on a lot of the pages, and you want to make this easy to find. So you don't want to bury it at the bottom. Maybe try to make it front and center, or put it out to the top part of a column so it catches attention of the people visiting the site.
Thank you, Julie. And another question that was shared with us is, what about comfort pets on the job?
Yeah, so that's a great topic. And I'm not sure of the exact question being asked with that, if it's about the comfort part of that, or if it's just about animals in the workplace. So I'm going to kind of address it from a general perspective of all animals. Our education is geared towards employers following their responsibilities under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the employment title. There are other titles that address public spaces, and they speak more towards service animals in those arenas. But for our conversation, Title I doesn't talk specifically about animals. What they talk about is the type of accommodation that you might need to make to permit the animal to be in the workplace. And so if a person requests for a comfort animal, an emotional support animal, or a service animal to be present in the workplace, as you're going through the interactive process to discuss that, the type of accommodation you're likely going to be making, if you determine this is the effective solution, is to modify a policy. You might have a no animal in the workplace policy that needs to be modified to permit the animal to be present. You might also need to be looking at or consider looking at modifying a break schedule so that if the animal is present in the workplace, the individual is able to modify their break to take care of the animal's needs during the workday. We have a fact sheet on this topic that we created that lives in our Inclusive Employer Toolkit that talks about some of the best practices to consider as you are going through the process of talking about having an animal in the workplace. It'll address some things like the animal needing to be under control of the individual who it is there with, that the animal's needs are the responsibility of the employees, but it also will address things like, what if another employee says, I have an allergy or I have a fear of an animal, and how can we accommodate everybody's needs at the same time? So it kind of helps best support you as you navigate this request. This is also a great example of how, or of a time that employer partners could reach out for a worksite accessibility consult to talk about this type of accommodation specific to your work environment, for some general ideas that might support you in that process.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you for your great questions. We are going to take another break before we finish, so please post any more questions that you have in the Q&A box. Julie, so far we have discussed how to craft a reasonable accommodation statement and where to post this. And we've talked about searchable resources for accommodation ideas employers can use with the individual making the request when neither of them are sure what the solution is. What other resources can employers add to their reasonable accommodation toolkit to support their interactive process?
Kelly, there are a variety of external community resources an employer may benefit from utilizing. The three we are going to highlight include the no-cost services and resources we have available for employers through OOD's Division of Employer and Innovation Services, or EIS. The no-cost services we provide for Ohioans with disabilities that can be accessed through our website, oodworks.com, and the lending libraries we are familiar with in Ohio.
Great, Julie. I'll start with some of the services we offer through EIS. We have an inclusive employer toolkit on the employers page of OOD's website, and I'd like to highlight some resources employers can find there to add to their toolkit and support their reasonable accommodation process. In the Building the Business Case section, we include information about tax incentives available for employers who hire individuals with disabilities, provide accommodations, and make accessibility changes in the workplace. We'll discuss how these can be useful resources a bit later in the webinar. Julie, the worksite accessibility consults you provide and have mentioned today are highlighted in the Workplace Accessibility section of the toolkit. Also in this section are some demonstrations of assistive technology that can be helpful in better understanding how these solutions enable individuals with disabilities to perform work tasks effectively. The technologies demonstrated include the screen reader known as JAWS, or Job Access with Speech, Zoom Text, which is a magnifying software with additional helpful features, and Dragon Speech Recognition, which is a speech-to-text software. And finally, we have an entire section of the toolkit dedicated to workplace accommodations, where employers can find helpful fact sheets and on-demand webinars on a variety of topics related to reasonable accommodations.
Kelly, that's a great summary of a few of the many ways we can support employers in their efforts to provide effective, reasonable accommodations. We also provide vocational rehabilitation, or VR, services through our Bureau of Vocational Rehabilitation, or BVR.
That's right, Julie. OOD offers services and support for Ohioans with disabilities to help attain and maintain employment at no cost. Our vocational rehabilitation services are voluntary and customized for each person through assessments and one-on-one meetings with professional counselors. Individuals who are interested may visit www.oodworks.com to learn about our services and apply.
Kelly, the reason it's helpful for employers to be aware of OOD's VR services is so they can share these as a resource for the employee when they are in the interactive process and additional support is needed to identify a solution. As you said, these services are voluntary and they're also confidential. So an employer cannot apply on behalf of the employee or inquire about whether they are receiving services, but they can inform the employee of this option.
Julie, another very helpful resource for employers to be aware of are the lending libraries we have here in Ohio.
Kelly, lending libraries can be such a great tool because items can be borrowed, often at no charge, and used at work to determine if they are effective before making a purchase. I am going to share 3 resources we are aware of. The first is Assistive Technology of Ohio, which is known as AT Ohio, and is housed at The Ohio State University. They have a device lending library with items that are categorized on their website by blind and low vision devices, communication and speech, computer access, deaf and hard of hearing, education and learning, and environmental aids to daily living. I'll share an item that can be borrowed from AT Ohio. In this example, an employee who is blind recently applied for and was hired as a principal at the elementary school where she has worked for the past 5 years. In her new role, the employee needs to frequently access the internet, email, and applications like Microsoft Word while traveling about the school to meet with staff. She needs a mobile device like a tablet that will enable her to access these applications using screen reading software and Braille. During the interactive process, she and the employer discuss whether a device called a Braille note taker may be effective in enabling her to perform these work tasks. The Braille note taker is a tablet capable of using screen reading software and includes a Braille display. The principal knows this device is available at AT Ohio and asks the employer to inquire about borrowing this so she can use it during a trial period to determine its effectiveness. The employer agrees and contacts the lending library to coordinate borrowing the device. OCALI also has a lending library. OCALI stands for the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence. Some of the items OCALI provides include tools to support reading, writing, organization, communication, blindness and low vision, deafness and hard of hearing, and computer and mobile device access. They offer technology which can be borrowed as software loaded on a laptop, apps loaded on a mobile device, or dedicated devices. So I'll share an item that can be borrowed from OCALI. I consulted with an employer who was in the interactive process with an employee who was hard of hearing. The employee informed the employer that a speech-to-text app might be useful in meetings to capture the conversation between colleagues. Both the employee and the employer wanted to try this idea to see if it would be helpful. I recommended the employer contact OCALI because they have tablets with speech-to-text apps that use artificial intelligence to transcribe conversations into text. By borrowing the device and using these apps, the employee and the employer could better assess whether this solution would be effective during meetings before making a purchase. And the final resource I'll share is from the Ohio Developmental Disabilities Council. They have a guide to assistive technology lending libraries in Ohio, which is a publication that provides a list of libraries focused on providing assistive technology to support people with developmental disabilities. This guide organizes libraries by the types of items they offer, their region in Ohio, and whether the item can be shipped. I recommend becoming familiar with what can be borrowed from these libraries because this could be helpful in identifying an effective accommodation in the future.
Julie, I agree. Lending libraries are such a great resource and a great addition to the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Toolkit. Now, I know you also have some tools you would like to share with employers on ways to implement, monitor, and fund reasonable accommodations efficiently. Let's talk first about implementing accommodations.
Sure, Kelly. I have some ideas that I think are helpful for employers to support the process of providing accommodations. We know that ADA does not require employers to establish a formal process for navigating the interactive process. However, it is a best practice to create one because it helps ensure that requests for accommodations are received and facilitated efficiently. Whether an employer has a formal process or not, one way to support implementing accommodations is to use a tool like documentation along the way. For example, some employers have a reasonable accommodation request form that employees can use if they wish to ask for what they need. Now, employees are permitted to request an accommodation in their preferred form of communication, so completing this form shouldn't be required, but having one can help inform the beginning of the interactive process. Jan has an example of a request form that asks a variety of questions like, what specific accommodation are you requesting? What job function are you having difficulty performing? And how will the accommodation assist you in performing the job function? Jan also has examples of medical inquiry forms that can be used when employers are permitted to obtain documentation to verify a disability or the need for the reasonable accommodation. We know this can occur when the disability, the need for the accommodation, or both are not obvious. And Jan has forms for approving accommodations, providing accommodations on a temporary or trial basis, and for documenting the steps along the way, like a checklist, to make sure the interactive process stays on track. These forms are available on Jan's website for employers to review and then customize to meet the needs of their workplace.
Julie, I especially think the example from Jan of a checklist for the interactive process could be useful for employers in their toolkit to keep the process moving. Your next item for the toolkit is about sign language interpreters.
Kelly, this is a toolkit item I think every employer can benefit from. It's a database of sign language interpreters an employer can quickly contact when they receive a request for interpretation. This resource is helpful because it's a time saver. If an employer waits until they receive a request for an interpreter and do not know who to call, it will take time to find resources and coordinate the service. This can delay providing an effective solution, which might be problematic for time-sensitive needs, like to participate in an interview for a job or attend an important meeting. However, if an employer has done their homework up front, they have a database of options to explore and can coordinate a solution efficiently. Now, if an employer has not yet received this request, it's still a best practice to prepare for receiving one. This can be a common request for the hiring process, and covered employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations for qualified candidates with disabilities to compete for jobs.
Julie, I can see where this would be very helpful. In fact, I know of a situation where an employer was hosting a large event and needed to provide the services of an ASL interpreter for an attendee. The employer contracted with an individual interpreter in advance to provide the interpreting services for the event. The interpreter went through the process to become an approved vendor in the employer's system, and they were all set to go. Well, on the day of the event, the interpreter was sick and could not provide the interpreting services. The employer reached out to OOD in a scramble for help in finding an ASL interpreter at the last minute. A database of interpreters where the employer could have quickly identified a backup would have been a great resource. With a tool like this, the employer could have even worked ahead and had a few interpreting services registered in their approved vendor system. Where should employers start to build their database?
Kelly, one tool employers can use to find sign language interpreters is OOD's searchable database. This includes resources for individuals and employers about deafness, deafblindness, and hearing loss. This database can be accessed from the Deaf Services for Ohioans webpage and can be used to find interpreters by county. To use this database, enter the service you are looking for, which in this case is sign language interpreting, and then enter the county you're searching for, such as Licking County, and then select search. This will bring up a list of providers OOD is aware of. Employers also may want to research vendors who provide video remote interpretation, known as VRI, so they have options for different situations and are familiar with who can provide the service. Now, when employers are searching for these providers, it can be helpful to contact the vendors to ask questions to become familiar with the services, like about pricing. For example, some interpreters who come on site require a minimum commitment of 2 hours, and they charge a certain rate. Vendors who provide interpreting remotely may have different pricing. Remote interpreting also requires certain technical requirements, so knowing these upfront can help employers to be prepared. It's also helpful to find out how these services are effective for certain situations. There are times it may be better to have an on-site interpreter, and other times when a remote interpreter is the best solution. Of course, the final decision is always determined through the interactive process when you are collaborating with the individual who made the request. Gathering this information ahead of time helps the employer to quickly assess the situation, collaborate with the candidate or employee, and together identify an effective solution efficiently.
Julie, creating a database of solutions for sign language interpretation is certainly an action item employers can consider moving forward with creating if they haven't already. It seems like this concept could carry over to other services that are provided as reasonable accommodations.
Kelly, you are right. There are some other services where employers could go through the same process, so they have easy access to a list of ideas to consider when a request is made. One example is Together Resources for CART, which stands for Communication Access Real-Time Translation. This is a service that uses a trained stenographer to transcribe what is said into a written format, like directly to a tablet for an individual employee in a meeting, or to an overhead screen for all attendees at a conference. Just like sign language interpretation, these providers can be on-site and remote. Some vendors offer CART in addition to sign language interpretation, so employers could consult with them to find out more about both services. Sometimes a driver is provided as a reasonable accommodation when an employee's job requires work-related travel. Employers could research rideshare services and ask about rates, areas served, and how to use these services. Individual cities may also have transit authorities that offer rideshare services, so that may be another resource to check. Another type of reasonable accommodation employers could research ahead of time are apps. There are a variety of apps available, some we talked about earlier, like speech to text, that can be helpful during meetings and conversations. There are also mindfulness apps that provide exercises like short meditations and breathing exercises that employees may use on a break to manage symptoms related to a mental health condition like anxiety disorder. Some employers provide these apps for all employees as a part of their mental health and wellness programs.
Julie, it makes sense that employers who familiarize themselves with these services and apps will be better informed when a request is made for an accommodation and better prepared to collaborate with the individual to find the best solution more efficiently. And that's great that some employers who are familiar with these apps are making them available to all employees to use if they want to. Those kinds of efforts can certainly help to foster an inclusive workplace culture. Let's move along in the interactive process now to the point that an accommodation has been implemented. It's important for employers to monitor these for effectiveness.
Right, Kelly. Just because an accommodation is identified and implemented doesn't mean it's automatically going to work. So it's important at this phase of the process to let the employee know who to contact if the accommodation is not effective, but also inform the employee that a designated party will be contacting them at a certain point to ask about the effectiveness of the accommodation as well. To support the employer's reasonable accommodation toolkit, we have another form to suggest for the employer's process. A list of sample forms Jan provides on their website includes a monitoring form. Employers can review this form to inform the version they wish to create for their workplace. The Jan example includes a variety of questions to follow up on accommodations, like asking whether training was provided, and if so, was the training effective in meeting the employee's needs? Another example relates to when services are provided. The form asks whether the service is meeting the employee's needs and asks who is responsible for arranging the service. This is important for monitoring accommodations that are implemented as needed, like sign language interpretation, rideshare services, or updates to assistive technology software. One more example in this form is asking whether the accommodation is successful in enabling the employee to perform the essential functions of the job. This is very helpful in determining whether the accommodation is effective or needs to be revisited.
Julie, it seems documentation is a key component of the employer's reasonable accommodation toolkit. And it sounds like Jan offers a real time saver for employers in the many examples of forms they can review before creating one of their own. Let's shift now to considering how funding options can help to support the process of providing accommodations.
Kelly, we often reference the Jan study, which tells us more than half of the reasonable accommodations implemented cost nothing at all. And those with a cost typically cost $500. So because there are times accommodations come with a cost, we are going to talk about budgeting for accommodations, creating a centralized fund for accommodations, and discuss the available tax incentives disability inclusive employers may be eligible for. Having a plan in place to address these costs can support employers in providing employees with disabilities what they need to perform the job and access the workplace.
Julie, what could an employer add to their toolkit to support the costs that may come with providing accommodations?
Kelly, employers can be prepared to provide accommodations that come with a cost by being proactive and creating a budget for accommodations to include in their toolkit. Some employers are likely already doing this through individualized budgets within various departments. Other employers are embracing centralized accommodation funds, which offer an enterprise-wide approach that streamlines the process for purchasing accommodations. At times, a centralized approach may be the preferred way to go because it can alleviate the concern hiring managers and supervisors sometimes have that the cost of accommodations have to come from their department's operating budget. It can also help to make the process of procuring and providing accommodations more consistent across an organization. To know how much money to put into your budget or centralized fund, it can be helpful to track the accommodations you provide so you know what you are already spending. This will at least give you a place to start. If you have an existing tracking system, you could simply review the past few years and average the costs to get an idea of a number to begin with. If you do not have a tracking system, this may be an item employers want to add to their toolkit. And this doesn't have to be an elaborate and expensive tracking system. It can be a simple Excel spreadsheet that indicates the type of accommodation and its associated cost and the date or dates the accommodation was provided. Of course, creating and using a centralized accommodation fund is going to be unique for each employer. If you are interested in creating this type of fund and want to learn from what other organizations have put into place, employer partners are welcome to contact their business relations specialist to arrange a worksite accessibility consult to discuss their unique goals.
Julie, as someone who has previously owned my own business, I think a budget is a fantastic idea. A natural question I think employers will have next is, what ideas can you share for how to fund the reasonable accommodation budget?
Kelly, I think it's helpful for the staff who are responsible for facilitating the reasonable accommodation process to talk with their financial and tax professionals about the tax incentives available to employers who employ individuals with disabilities, provide reasonable accommodations, and make changes to create an accessible workplace. There are three main tax incentives employers may wish to explore further. The first is the Disabled Access Credit. This is a credit for small businesses who incur costs associated with providing reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. This credit can be taken each year there are expenses. The second is the Barrier Removal Tax Deduction. This is a deduction related to the removal of architectural and transportation barriers related to the mobility of individuals with disabilities. The deduction is a maximum of $15,000 a year for qualified expenses that normally must be capitalized. The third is the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. This credit is available to employers who hire individuals from specific groups who have faced significant barriers to employment. This includes individuals with disabilities served through vocational rehabilitation agencies like OOD. So it can be helpful to be aware of these tax incentives and have a discussion with tax professionals to determine eligibility. Some employers who are eligible use these funds toward their reasonable accommodation budgets and their disability inclusion efforts in the workplace.
Julie, that sounds like a helpful way to get a budget started or keep one going. Thanks for sharing. Okay, let's take a break to see what further questions have come in. First question we have, Julie, is could you touch on the employer's right to speak directly with the employee's medical provider, seek clarification on a requested or recommended accommodation?
Sure. So one of the ideas or best practices that we often share on how you can help identify what the effective solution is if you as the employer don't know and if the individual making the request doesn't know. And one of those is to consult with a medical provider. So, there's really two ways you can consider moving forward with this and pick what works best for you and the individual that you're working with. You could draft the documentation that would be helpful for that provider. So you're asking the questions that you're permitted to ask. And you've already created the form so that the medical provider doesn't have to create one. And you can just give that to the individual to take to their provider, and then the provider can return that to the individual, and they can turn it into the employer. The reason that can be a good idea to consider is that the individual is then in control of the information they share with the employer, because there are some limits to what information the employer can request about disability. You can't request an entire medical record, so to speak. So sometimes that's the best way to handle this, is just draft the documentation that gets to what you need to help you in the interactive process come up with the effective solution, but give that document to the individual to handle with the medical provider. Or you could consider, if on a case-by-case basis, it's better to obtain consent from the individual making the request, that you can reach out to their medical provider so you have their permission before you move forward with that. So those are the two options that you could consider to decide what's best for your unique situation.
Thank you, Julie. The next question is, can you show the name of those agencies again? For example, Ocali.
Yeah, so AT of Ohio is the lending library, and Ocali has a lending library, and both of those are indicated on the learner's guide that accompanies this training, with the links, as well as that guide that we shared that shows the lending libraries throughout the state related to technology that supports individuals with developmental disabilities. So we have all of that information organized into the learner's guide. And if you do not have that and want to reach out to one of us, we can quickly connect you with that resource.
Thank you, Julie. And we did have one question that was submitted with registration, and that is, how do you balance an accommodation for remote working with the wants of the manager for the employee to be in person?
So my answer to this is going to be general, because it really could apply to any accommodation the person's requesting, not just remote work or telework. When an individual makes a request and you're engaged in that interactive process, you're collaborating with the person to ask what do they think is the effective solution. But as the employer, you're also able to identify effective solutions, and you work together in this process to figure out what are all the possibilities to remove this barrier, so the person is able to access the work-related activity or perform the essential function effectively. The guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission does say that employers should consider the preference of the individual making the request, but ultimately the employer can choose amongst the effective solutions. So the key here is that the solution the employer chooses has to be an effective solution, and removing whatever the barrier is so the person can participate in the work-related activity. What I would suggest is just documenting along the way what your justification is that makes the choices effective and why you went with the solution that you went with. But I would say stick to the guidance that we have for the interactive process from the EEOC to help you kind of navigate those situations.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for your questions. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. Julie, what closing thoughts do you have?
Thank you, Kelly. As we know, each employer is unique, which means how they navigate receiving a request for a reasonable accommodation and facilitate the interactive process will also be unique. We've shared many ideas employers can consider when creating their own reasonable accommodation toolkit to support their process and make it as effective and efficient as possible. We began with ideas for crafting a reasonable accommodation statement, so when a candidate or employee with a disability needs an accommodation, they know who to contact with their request. We also talked about resources employers can use to generate ideas for accommodations during the interactive process, like using the Jan A to Z list, which allows employers to search accommodation ideas by disability type and work function. We also shared external resources that can help employers identify reasonable accommodation solutions, like borrowing an item from a lending library to try it first and determine if it is effective. And we talked about ways to implement, monitor, and fund reasonable accommodations effectively through using forms and documentation, compiling a list of vendors who provide services like sign language interpretation, and considering whether you are eligible for tax incentives, which can help to fund accommodations that do come with a cost.